Well, welcome, guys. Thank you for joining us here this morning. My name's Tyler Osantowske. I'm the Next Gen pastor here. So I have the privilege of overseeing everything that happens with our kids and students, so anybody from the age of 0 to the age of 18. And so I want to welcome you guys here. If you're new with us, thanks for joining us this morning. You might recognize or you might not recognize some of the younger faces in our crowd this morning. We are joined by our elementary age kids this morning. So if you are a kid between kindergarten and 5th grade, let me talk to you for a second. So if you're between kindergarten and 5th grade, mom or dad, you might have to help them. Just give me your attention for the next 20 seconds because I want to talk to you for a second. You guys are awesome. You guys know that? You guys are great. You guys are sweet. You're cool. And thanks for being here. And I'm going to let you get the wiggles out here. So what I want you guys to do, if you're a kindergarten through 5th grader, turn to the adult that brought you or your parent who brought you and give them a fist bump and say, "I'm so glad I'm here." Go ahead. Because here's the truth this morning is we are glad that you are here. We are so excited that you get to worship with us this morning, that you get to be here with us this morning. If you're new with us here at CBC, this might be your first time or second time, this is what we call our family worship experience. It's something that we used to do in the past that we're going to start doing more of because, and really what we do here is we close our elementary hallway, kids who are in kindergarten through 5th, we close that hallway so that those kids can be invited to worship here with us. And the reason we do that is that this is the end game for them. When they graduate high school, this is where they're going to end up. And we don't want the gathering on Sunday mornings to be a mystery to them. We want them to develop memories. We want them to develop experience here with us on Sunday morning. And so we're invited them here. So kids, so thank you for being here with us. We are excited you're here. You guys are actually going to have a part that I need your help in later in the service. So what I want you guys to do is just be sitting on the edge of your seats, waiting for that part, and pay attention to not only what I'm saying, but what God might be saying to you. Because, church, I believe that God speaks to our kids and to our students, and I believe they are so important. And what I'm excited about this morning is we get to talk about how important they are, how important the next generation is. So again, I just want to thank you for being here. Let's dive into what God might have for us this morning. We're going to be in the story of Nehemiah. And just kind of as a caveat, I hope you don't mind, but I like being comfortable when I preach. So I love sitting because sitting is comfortable. And if not, I'll burn a hole in the stage by pacing. So I hope you're comfortable as well. So we're going to be in Nehemiah this morning, chapters 1 through 6. And so we're going to cover a lot of material. I'm going to retell a lot of the story. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the story of Nehemiah. And at different parts, I'm going to show you some really important principles that we can pull out when it comes to the story of Nehemiah. So I've been rereading this story over the last few months, and I've been realizing a lot of new things. And I don't know if it's because of maybe the phase of life I'm in or things that are going on in my life, but the story of Nehemiah holds so much truth. And what surprises me is and it shouldn't because God's word is amazing, but the stories, the things that happen in these stories, how applicable they are to our own lives. And so I've been rereading Nehemiah and just some context about what is happening. You see, the story of Nehemiah is about the town of Jerusalem. And back in 2 Kings, what we see is the Babylonians come in and destroy Jerusalem, obliterate Jerusalem. There are ruins. The town is in ruins. The community is struggling. And what seems like what is happening is that the people of Jerusalem are in this state of unknown of what's going to happen about their future. They're kind of in this crisis of faith. And you see, reading through this story, there must have been a couple other things that were true for Jerusalem. It was either they had been in this condition for so long that they didn't know anything different, or they had been in this condition for so long that they didn't see a brighter future. How could things get any better? And I think a lot of us can relate to that if we're honest with ourselves, because what ends up happening in our own lives is that things happen, bad things happen, or we get stuck in a rut. and we don't see a brighter future, so we just accept it. We just accept what's happening in our lives as that's just how it is. Or on the other hand, we just give up, right? We give up. We stop imagining. We stop dreaming. And because of that, we just give up and we live in it. And so that's the context of our story. That's what's happening in Jerusalem this morning. What we learn from the people of Jerusalem and through Nehemiah, what we learned through this story is priceless. And it has a ton of layers. So we're going to peel back those layers this morning. And the idea is this story reaffirms the idea that we can do more together. We can always do more together. And not only that, we can do more together, but we can do more together. When we do something together, we have the potential to affect how a generation sees God. And this story is really applicable to any of our needs in our community, but I want to focus on this morning are the needs within our own next generation that's coming up. I love that we just did child dedication because that is a perfect example, a setting, an experience for parents to be able to leverage what they have, to be able to lead their kids to a relationship with Jesus. And so what is happening is that there is a generation in ancient Jerusalem that is sitting on the sidelines. There's a generation that is disillusioned with the faith of their parents and grandparents. And what ends up happening is I imagine kids and teenagers living in Jerusalem kind of getting maybe annoyed or maybe kind of sick of hearing all the great stories of, man, you should have seen what God did back in Joshua's time. You should have seen all these things that God did, yet they're living in ruins. And so I imagine a smart 13-year-old, if you're a parent of a teenager, you might know what I'm talking about, but imagine a smart 13-year-old kind of going, you know what, wait a minute, Dad, if Joshua can blow a horn and the walls of Jericho can fall down, if Moses could raise a staff and he splits the Red Sea, if David could kill a giant with a single stone, then why can't we fix what's broken? Why can't we do something? If God can do all those things through them, why won't God do something through us? With that smart attitude, as any 13-year-old might have. And so he's disillusioned with this idea. And so I imagine a lot of teenagers in that town started losing respect for the faith of their parents and leaders, feeling that God wasn't with them like he used to be. And the next thing you know, his son is telling his dad or his mom, you know what, the temple on Saturday, not my thing. I'm gonna sleep in. That whole Passover celebration, that big holiday you celebrate, I don't really see the purpose of it. My favorite one, that goat that you gave me a couple years ago as a pet, so you say? No more sacrifices. I'm keeping them this year. They became disillusioned. And this is why this story is so important, because just as there was a generation sitting on the sidelines in ancient Jerusalem, there's a generation sitting on the sidelines today, waiting and are skeptical about church because they hear us talking about the goodness of God. They hear us talking about how great God is, yet they don't see us doing much. And I think this is where we can take a page out of Nehemiah's book, because Nehemiah was a doer. He was somebody who stopped talking about the issue and actually did something about it. And so we can learn a few things through Nehemiah's story. And I think the first thing we can learn is that we need to name what's broken. You see, our story starts this morning in Nehemiah, the first chapter. Our story starts with someone showing up to Nehemiah. Nehemiah was serving King Artaxerxes in Susa at the time. We'll get into his job later. But as he's serving King Artaxerxes, a messenger shows up, and the messenger says this: those who survived the exile are back in the province, are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. You see, the town was in ruins. There were holes in the walls, or they were at danger. A community was in danger. And Nehemiah's first response was to mourn and was to fast and was to pray. And he sat in that knowledge that his hometown, that his place of his people was in utter ruin. And Nehemiah was showing us something through spending time in the knowledge. He was showing that if we can't name the problem, we can't fix the problem. If you can't name what's going on in your community, you can't actually fix it. You see, sometimes we need to assess the situation. We need to realize what's broken. We need to name what's broken. And Nehemiah became aware of what was happening in his community. Nehemiah became aware his hometown was in trouble, and the people were vulnerable in multiple ways. There were, like I said, holes in the walls. The enemies were outside the gates, ready to attack. Their future existence as a people was at stake, and they lived in fear of how they were going to survive. And so Nehemiah prayed, and he sat in that moment, and he recognized that the state of his people was not where God had promised they would be. You see, every once in a while, it's good for us as a church to have a wake-up call. Because here's what happens, right? We really easily get comfortable around people we know. We get comfortable around people who are like us. And so we get into our groups and our communities, which community is great. But what ends up happening is when we get comfortable, we start looking inward. And when we look inward, we become uninformed about what's happening around us. And we don't know what's happening. And when we don't know what happens, when we're in that type of state, when bad news comes about what happens, it shocks us. How in the world could that happen? And it's what we do with that bad news that determines our character. What do we do? Do we ignore that bad news? Or do we turn a blind eye? Or maybe for some of us, and I think we might fall into this camp more, maybe for some of us, we just accept it as what's happening. We say, oh, that's just how our world works. That's just what our country is. Or do we actually do something about it? You see, I'm going to suggest something, and you don't have to agree with me, but hear me out. I'm going to suggest that if our church ignores the problems of our community, we forfeit the right to have influence in our community. If we are not actually going to do something about it, if we are not actually willing to actually name what's broken, then we forfeit our influence. Now, we might have influence with each other, and that's good, but we will not with our community. You see, we don't have influence. You don't have influence with the people around you because you're right. You have influence with the people around you because you care. I mean, that's the truth. If I was always right but never cared, you'd never listen to me. We will forfeit our right if we're not willing, or if we ignore the problem. You see, we need to start naming what's broken, and we need a wake-up call when it comes to the next generation. So here's some statistics that I looked up this past couple weeks. And this is about our communities. This is about Livingston County. This is about Michigan as a whole. So listen to these with me. 40% of high school students in Michigan have reported they felt sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row so that they stopped doing some of their usual activities. 21% of high school and middle school students have reported they seriously considered attempting suicide more than once in their lifetime. That's before they're even 18. 9% of students have actually attempted that, which leads to suicide being the third leading cause of death for minors. That's in Michigan. That's not like a countrywide, that's probably just like those West Coast people. That's Michigan. That's the kids sitting next to you. 15% of high schoolers drink regularly. In 2017, there was 267 kids in Livingston County at risk for homelessness. Half of those kids were actually considered homeless in 2017. 48% of children have experienced a traumatic, life-changing event by the time they're 18. I don't know if that's not a wake-up call to you. I don't really know what else to tell you, because those are the students and kids that you're sitting with. Those are the students and kids that you see out in public. When you drive, when you get mad at that kid that cuts you off on the road, that's him. You see, Nehemiah didn't ignore the brokenness, and he didn't excuse it. What he did was he went and did something. And what's really interesting about the story is that he didn't expect, he didn't wait for a miracle. Did you ever notice that? It's okay to accept a miracle in our lives, but it's not okay to just sit back and wait for one. And what I mean by that is that Nehemiah didn't wait for God to tell him what to do. He didn't sit back and wait for God to tell him. He just went and did. And you can see this throughout his entire prayer. You see what happens is in his prayer in the first chapter, he apologizes to God. He repents because, look, the people of Jerusalem were broken. They did sin just like any of us. And then he also reminded God saying, hey, here are the promises you gave to our people. But then it's kind of like he panics. It's kind of like he's like, have you ever guys gotten in the mood where you're about to do something big and you're like, I don't know what the heck I'm doing, but here we go. And that's what Nehemiah does. Nehemiah goes, all right, God, I don't know what I'm about to do, but hey, help me because here I go. See, and Nehemiah named what's broken. And then he went and did something. And he moved quickly. You see, what's interesting at the end of the first chapter, what he says, after he hears the news, after he sits in that knowledge, he says a really simple statement, and it's this: I was the cupbearer to the king. I was the cupbearer to the king. And what Nehemiah is doing when saying this, he is showing us who he is not. You see, Nehemiah was not a spiritual leader. He was a cupbearer. His only job was to make the Persian king happy. He was a cupbearer, and so what he was showing us is he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a spiritual leader, and please do not miss this. Your responsibility for caring for people does not come from your profession. Your responsibility has nothing to do with your profession. It does not matter what you do for a career. You still have a responsibility for the people in your community. And not because you're good people, but because you're God's people. You are called to love and to care for people. And we're responsible for engaging in a broken world, not because it's our job description, but because we are God's people. You see, here's the thing. We are the church, and we are the ambassadors of the Son of the living God. And the truth is that we have a responsibility to show the world who Jesus is. You see, with this statement, I was the cupbearer to the king, he is implying something. Nehemiah is implying something else. He's implying that he was going to leverage whatever he had. He had privileges that he could leverage. And so Nehemiah taught us an important principle. There are going to be times in your life where you're going to have to leverage whatever you have. You see, we as God's people are called to leverage whatever we have for other people. Whatever status, whatever connections, whatever influence, resource, privilege, whatever finances, whatever we have, we are called to leverage for people who are broken and who are hurting. Not because we're trying to be good people, but because we are God's people. You see, what I love about that is it reminds me a lot of the people I get to serve with. You see, as a next-gen pastor, I love hearing the stories about people, no matter where they come from, the wins, that we like to call them in next-gen. We like to call things wins. And I love hearing the stories of, I'm an engineer by day, but come Wednesday night, I'm a 7th grade small group leader. I'm a stay-at-home mom. During the week, I get to hang out with my kids, but come Sunday morning, I get the opportunity to serve and lead preschoolers. I'm a teacher for middle schoolers during the week, but you know what? Come Sunday nights, my responsibility is as an underclassmen small group for a group of 10 girls. Because when I hear those stories, I think they get it. You see, people, we need to be willing to leverage whatever it is we have. And what Nehemiah shows us is not only is he willing to leverage whatever he has, but he's willing to risk it. You see, it was risky for Nehemiah to approach the king for help. He was going to risk everything he had to approach the king, because it wasn't like hey, I serve you, king, but we're best friends. It wasn't that type of relationship. It was a relationship of when the king says jump, you ask how high. And so he risked everything he had to approach the king for help. And so Nehemiah does that. And the thing is we can't expect to rebuild anything or restore anything unless we're willing for it to cost us personally. Sammy, let's be honest for a second. We all want preschoolers to get a better start. We all want to rescue kids out of foster care. We want teenagers to have consistent mentors. We want to fix what's broken in our community. We want to restore the brokenness in our community, only if it doesn't cost us personally. Only if it doesn't cost me money. Only if I don't have to go spend time doing it. You're telling me I got to show up every Sunday night? You're telling me I got to show up once a week for a kid? We all want that. But what we need are Nehemiahs. We need people who are not only willing to leverage what they have, but risk what they have. to invest in the next generation. You see, here's the thing. Nehemiah, after doing all these things, went and continued his story. He didn't stop there. He actually left his comfort zone, and he left for the sake of the people. You see, he went to Jerusalem in person, and he wanted to see the situation up close and personal. He wanted to see what was happening. He wanted to ride around the walls and get up close and personal. And he wanted to roll up his sleeves and actually do something that is tangible. And this is incredibly strong because here's the thing. If you want to be a leader who has influence with people around you, if you want to engage with people who are in your community and have a lasting influence, then you need to go see for yourself. You need to go see the problems for yourself. Sometimes we need to encourage each other to get on the front lines. Because if you don't go see for yourself, you will never embrace the engagement that people need in your community, that people need from you. You will limit your effectiveness. You see, here's the thing. Nehemiah had to go to Jerusalem. He had to ride around the city walls. He had to see what was broken. He had to actually experience the brokenness for himself. He had to have the conversations with the leaders to create a plan. Why? Because proximity changes perspective. Proximity to the problem changes your perspective on the problem. You see, Nehemiah showed us that the closer we get, the better we can see. You see, the more of us that get close to the brokenness, the more impact we'll have in our community. You know, if enough of us would get close enough, maybe we could do something about what seems impossible. If enough of us would get close enough to parents with kids who have special needs, if enough of us would get close enough to broken teenagers, if enough of us would get close enough to people who are of different color than us, if enough of us get close enough to people who live below the poverty line, for people who are hurting because of injustices or live a life against all odds, maybe we would get bothered enough to do something about it. You see, we should never measure the success of our church based on the amount of people that sit here on a Sunday morning. Rather, we should measure our success by the amount of people who are willing to go show up, to embrace the brokenness. And so how do we start showing up? How do we do that? That's hard for us to kind of fathom. And so how do we do that? Well, for me, I believe that it's making a priority to show up in the life of a kid and teenager. To show up in the life of a kid or teen and give every kid an adult who will show them who Jesus is. You see, our community is full of kids who are broken, who see brokenness everywhere they go, their homes, their neighborhoods, their schools, their friend groups. And the best way to fix a broken community, I believe, starts with our kids. Because we have a generation waiting on the sidelines. And the more adults we get closer to kids and teenagers, the more impact we'll have on a community. Because what I believe is that there is no substitute in a kid's life for a consistent adult outside of their parents. There's no substitute for that. And here's the thing, if we're not willing to get close enough, we will lose them. The statistics show it. The statistic is by the time kids reach 18, 75% of them will walk away from the church. Some of them might come back. Like here's a visual representation of that. So you guys walk away from the church. You guys walk away from the church. You guys walk away from the church. Congratulations, guys, you stuck. So that's all of you guys. Like if we're gonna put the stat in real life, like kids when they graduate, this portion will leave. And some of you guys might come back, but most of you will leave and walk away from Jesus. And I don't know about you, but that statistic terrifies me. And I don't want that for our kids and teenagers. And so going back to our story here, Nehemiah, after he does all these things, after he goes and shows up, he gives this vision statement. He rallies the troops, and what he does is it's really short, but it's powerful. And so kids, here is your part. Here is where I need your help. So there's going to be a verse up on the screen. So if you're 18 or under, so if you're in high school or younger, I want you to help me read this first verse. And then adults, I want you to join in on the second verse that comes up on the screen. Pay attention to what's being said by who, okay? So kids, your job is going to come up. So if we want to throw that verse up on the screen for everybody to see. So read it with me. 1, 2, 3. You see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. All right, adults, your turn. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. There are kids asking you. They may not say it, but they're waiting for you to do something. You see, this was an interesting group of volunteers. What it was perfume makers, jewelry designers, pastors, priests, preachers, politicians, and a cupbearer. And this group of volunteers came together and they made construction crews. I'm not the most handy person in the world. I'm not handy at all, if we're just going to be honest. And there were people like me who are not handy doing construction, which for some of you guys like terrifies you. But they were the ones that rebuilt the walls. And see, what that teaches us is sometimes we just have to do something we don't know how to do. You see, I love this story because so many people just decided to do what needed to be done. You see, what's really interesting is that Nehemiah didn't say, hey, here's a spiritual gifts test. I want you to take this, pray about it for a couple weeks, take it, figure out your strengths, come back to me, and then we'll put you where you needed to be. What's super interesting about this situation is that they didn't even pray to God what they needed to do because they already knew what they needed to do. And they prayed while they did it. They didn't wait for God to tell them, or they didn't wait for the professionals to teach them what to do. They just went and did it and learned along the way. You see, here's the thing. They did it because people were in danger. People were in need. The city was broken. You see, we need to be people that are willing to do what we don't know what to do. You see, Nehemiah never said once that it was going to be easy. And here's the thing. As a church, we're not going to ask you to do something easy. For those of you that lead kids and students, you know it is not easy dealing with throw up or dealing with a sassy middle schooler or a broken high schooler. And so what we're going to ask you is not easy. It's hard. It's not supposed to be easy. If it was easy, everybody would do it. You see, here's the thing. Today we're going to invite you to do something bigger because I want you to imagine what could happen in the heart of a generation if we decided to work together, if we decided to do this thing together. You see, there's another group I want to challenge today. And this group might seem common sense to challenge them. That makes sense. But Nehemiah rallied this group at the perfect time. You see, I had a leader in my life once tell me that in every big project or situation, there's always going to be a storm. There's always going to be a moment where something falls apart or two people start butting heads or something happens and storms come. And so here's our storm in our story. We're about halfway through building the wall. The town of Jerusalem is about halfway through getting the walls up and building the community back up. And then tempers start flaring. People start falling apart. Things start falling apart. Everything starts piling on at once. And the storm hits. And then Nehemiah does something amazing. Nehemiah does something that is genius. You see, the enemies were right outside the gates ready to attack. And there were still holes in the walls. There were still gaps where they had not built up yet. And in that moment, Nehemiah does something genius. Listen to me when I say this. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the walls at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords and spears and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families. Sons and daughters, wives and homes. Can you imagine the emotion of this situation? See, everybody knows the enemy was about to attack. Everybody knows that they are in danger. So Nehemiah organizes them by families and says, remember who you're fighting for. In that one move, Nehemiah recasted the vision in a way that was personal. It no longer was about a broken city. It was no longer about meeting a need. It was even no longer about demonstrating who God was. It was about something personal. It was about their families. It was about their homes, their kids, their spouses. And you know what's super crazy? When parents stood in the gap, the enemy decided not to attack. They saw what was happening. And this one strategic move on Nehemiah's part changed the momentum of the story. Nehemiah made parents the champion of the story. And sure, Nehemiah, do not get me wrong, Nehemiah always pointed the people of Jerusalem back to God and how God saved Jerusalem. And there was a sense that Nehemiah positioned the parents where they could be heroes. He asked them to stand in the gap. He sparked their emotional awareness of the situation. And he made them heroes in the hearts of the kids. I mean, think about the situation with me. Imagine what's going on here. There is an enemy outside the walls ready to attack these people, take over these people, and they're done after this. There's no way they can fight. Everybody's trying to rebuild the walls. Nobody's ready to fight. And so Nehemiah puts parents in the gap and says, fight for your families. And what my mind goes to is that preschooler or that elementary kid or that middle schooler sitting there watching this. Think about that with me. Think about what they're thinking hey, I know we're in probably a bad situation here, but there's my dad. There's my mom ready to fight for me. I'm protected because my mom and dad are sitting there waiting to defend me. What an amazing story. What an amazing example for you as parents. If you are a parent in this room, you have such an opportunity and such a privilege to defend the honor of your kids, to lead them into a relationship with the God who loves them. Don't waste that. Don't waste the opportunity you have, because it is an amazing opportunity for you. And what's super crazy in this story, when parents stood in the gap for kids, the enemy didn't attack. The enemy saw what was happening, saw that Jerusalem was willing to fight for themselves, and didn't attack. You see, Nehemiah made the parents the champions of this story. And here's my point in all of this, is that if we as a church can cast a vision to inspire every parent to really understand what's really at stake for their kids, then we can change the momentum of this church. We can change the momentum of our community, and it will change the way a community sees this church. You see, here's what happens in the story. The walls were built in 52 days at the astonishment of the skeptics. So at the enemies, they were astonished at the amazement of the people inside the walls, but most importantly, the wonderment of a generation sitting on the sidelines. And three things happen when the walls were rebuilt. The first one is that those outside the walls, the skeptics, they changed what they believed about God. It says in Nehemiah 6:16, it says, when all their enemies heard about this, all the... Hear me? There we go. All the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. The skeptics, the enemies realized what was happening. They realized who was really at work in this story. The second one is those inside the walls changed how they listened to God. Nehemiah 8:3 is about Ezra the priest reading scriptures to the people, and it said this: he read it aloud from daybreak till noon as he faced the square before the water gate in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of the law. Let's just be honest here, that's a really long Sunday school class, and yet people listened the entire time. Why? Because what God just did through them changed how they listen to God. And the third thing, and I think the most important thing, is a generation changed how they worshiped God. In verse 17, it says, there's a statement about how they worship, and it says this: from the day of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated it like this, and their joy was very great. See, here's the thing, that's what we want for CBC. That's what we want for our church. We want to work together in such a way that impacts the way a generation sees God. And here's the thing, that's why we need you. We need you to do that. Everybody that was in Jerusalem, everybody that was needed to rebuild the wall in our story of Nehemiah was already in Jerusalem. Everybody that we need to impact the next generation is already here at CBC. We need you. And that's why we need you today to make a simple decision. Will you help us in will you join us in helping us change how a generation sees God? Will you help us in engaging the kids and students of our community? Will you do that with us? Will you invest in the next generation? See, you have the opportunity to change a kid's understanding of God. You have the chance to change how a kid understands their own faith. And we can't do this without people like you who are going to step in for parents to fill the gap. Help us change our community by engaging kids and students, by empowering parents to fill in the gaps, and by leveraging whatever it is you have. Will you do that with me? Will you do that with us? I'm going to invite Alyssa up here because we're going to go into a time of reflection. And because what I want you to do is I want you to spend the next couple of minutes talking with your God, talking with the God who loves you and cares for you. And so the question here is this, is how do we get involved? How do we actually do what we're talking about this morning? You see, I'm a guy who loves next steps. Like I love being able to just say, hey, here's the one thing you can do and let's get this ball rolling. So what you guys can do this morning, if you, depending on what camp you fall in, what group you fall in, if you call your church home here at CBC, if you regularly attend here, if you love what God is doing in this church and want to be a part of it, we will give you an opportunity this morning. Inside your bulletin, there's a volunteer card that looks like the one that's up on the screen. If you could fill that out for me, because all this is really an opportunity for you to connect with me or with one of my staff members, one of our leaders. This doesn't commit you to anything. Let me just be honest here, because I don't want this to be a bait and switch thing. What I want this to be is an opportunity for you to connect with us and just be able to have a conversation with us about what God might be doing in your heart. And so the easiest thing to do is just to fill out that card.